So the mechanism underlying biodiversity is evolution. Evolution is why we have so many different species of different things instead of all just one thing. And you should all be very familiar with evolution, survival of the fittest, all that kind of thing. Microevolution is evolution below the species level. And this we see in real time. We've never seen a new species evolve, but microevolution we see constantly. That's why if you decided to take an antibiotic that was being used in the 60s, it wouldn't work because the bacteria have evolved to be immune to that antibiotic, or at least not nearly as effective. Pesticide resistance happens all the time. We have to change pesticides because the insects get immune to the pesticide. That's microevolution. The example that you hear about the moths in the trees in the Industrial Revolution, there was a moth where there were white ones and then there were dark ones, and the light colored ones are much more common than the dark ones until the Industrial Revolution, when the bark on the trees started turning black from coal dust and smoke. Then all of a sudden there were much fewer of the gray ones and many more of the black ones. So that's microevolution. Macroevolution gives rise to new species, new genera, family, class, phyla, the whole taxonomic tree. It changes one species into another one. And that takes at the very least thousands of years. So this is not something that we've observed since we've been looking for things like that. You can't see that in a human lifetime. So biodiversity looks at the diversity of the species, their genes, their populations, and their communities. It's not just the number of different species. There are three types of diversity. Ecosystem diversity is the variety of ecosystems within a given region. So if you have a region that has a state, think about Texas. Texas goes from the coast up into the panhandle area. You have marine ecosystems, you have coastal ecosystems, coastal prairie, you have desert ecosystems, you have forest ecosystems, you have swamps, all within the same state. New Mexico doesn't have quite as much ecosystem diversity. We still have quite a bit. We have deserts of different kinds. You walk through the desert in Alamogordo and walk through the desert here, different plants, very different organisms. We have mountain ecosystems, which are very different from the deserts. We have the riparian areas around the rivers, but not quite as much diversity as Texas because it goes from the coast inland quite a ways. So we don't have those coastal ecosystems. Species diversity. This is the variety of species in a given ecosystem. Speciation, which is the generation of a new species, increases biodiversity. We're going to talk about mass extinctions in this unit. And after a mass extinction, at first, you only have a few species left. And because of speciation, those species change to fill all the empty niches left by everything that died. And so you get more, you go from very little diversity, and over millions of years, the diversity increases. After one of the mass extinctions, there was a specific type of dinosaur that was it took over the planet. All of them were this specific family of dinosaurs until speciation was able to catch up. Genetic diversity is the variety of genes within a species. And different things can change that. There's a species of, I think it's one of the sea lions anyway, and I think it's on this PowerPoint later. We wiped out all of it except about 20 of them. And then we stopped hunting them and their numbers increased. But because all the ones that are there came from 20 individuals, their genetic diversity is very low. In fact, any two individuals are more closely related than most siblings are of other species. when you look at their genetics. And then you have other species that have been evolving and have had huge populations for a very long time, and they can have a very large genetic diversity. So here's the different steps. We have ecosystem diversity. Here we have the ocean, the river, the forest, the mountains. Species diversity, we have trees, woodpeckers, bears, ground squirrels, mushrooms, grass, all the plants. And then you have genetic diversity, which is, we're just looking at the ground squirrels. Okay, so let's talk about species. A species is defined as a group of individuals that actually or potentially interbreed in nature. So it gets a little bit complicated because a lot of animals that don't come in contact normally in nature can interbreed if you stick them together. Several species spread over the entire world, but there's slight variations from one to the other. And there's taxonomists that have different philosophies, and there's lumpers and splitters. Lumpers tend to want to put more species and combine many species into one. Splitters want to separate many species into different ones, or one species into many different ones. Now we've done that with fish. You look at these trout and salmon, and they all look like they're the same species, and then they study them genetically and realize they've been isolated from each other because of the streams they interbreed in, and are different enough to be considered different species, even though if you look at them, they all look like the same fish. It's not always all that cut and dried, like I said. Hybrids do occur between closely related species. The state lizard of New Mexico is a whiptail that only has females. There are no males. And the reason that happened is because it actually is these different kinds of whiptails that interbred. And when they interbred, the offspring are all female. There's no males. And they actually managed to reproduce through parthenogenesis. The females can lay eggs that are fertile. So we have a species now that originated as a hybrid between two species, and there are no males, they're all females. Okay, so even if you can get hybrids, there's still a distinct species if it occurs rarely enough that the parent species are still separate. And if you think about it, if it doesn't occur rarely, eventually those two species will join together if they keep interbreeding. And so you will lose both species. Geographically separated organisms can often interbreed when they're introduced, but in the wild they never have the opportunity to interbreed, so they don't. So just be aware that the species definition can get complicated. And I always get a lot of questions about hybrids. Let's talk about hybrids for a little bit. They have a way that they name them. You take the first half of the father's name and the second half of the mother's name. So a hybrid between a lion and a tiger can either be a liger or a tigon, depending on which one's the father and which one's the mother. And they can look surprisingly different from each other. I don't remember which one of these is which, but these are, one is a liger, one's a tigon. One is much, much bigger than either of a lion or a tiger by itself. And this one has kind of the body of a lion and the legs and face of a tiger. So they do interbreed when you put them together in zoos. And of course, in the wild, that would never happen because lions and tigers don't interact with each other. They're not close, they don't live in the same areas. So a mule, we've used those enough that we don't use the naming convention. They've given them their own name. It's a horse and a donkey. A zonkey is a zebra and a donkey. And a zorse is a zebra and a horse. And these are fairly rare. Even when they put them together, they usually don't want to make these hybrids. Zebras are usually attracted to other zebras instead of horses or donkeys, but it does occasionally happen. Most of the time when you do this, they are sterile, so they can't interbreed. So that makes them still distinct species because the offspring cannot interbreed, usually. Here's an interesting one with a hilarious name, the Pizzly bear. Polar bears and grizzly bears are starting to hybridize. And some of that's because of climate change. Polar bears are starting to move into areas where they didn't used to be, and grizzly bears are starting to move north because it's getting warmer, there's less ice, and so grizzly bears and polar bears are interacting, and you get Pizzly bears. So where did this video go? All right, well, let me show you the video, even though I thought it was on here. All right.
Hi, this is Emily. Animals of different species rarely get it on, and when they do, they... Hi, this is Emily.
There we go. All right, so this talks about hybrids.
Emily. Animals of different species rarely get it on, and when they do, they rarely produce offspring. But even rarer than the ligers, zonkies, camas, and beefalo of the world are hybrid animals capable of making babies of their own. In fact, the idea of a mule, the hybrid progeny of a female horse and a male donkey, having its own baby is so implausible that the ancient Romans used to employ the saying, "when the mule foals," as a metaphor for the impossible. The same way that Americans say, "when pigs fly," Turkish people say, "when fish climb trees," and Nigerians say, "when the chicken has teeth." Here's why. In order to successfully reproduce, animals need to create viable sex cells. Normal body cells have 2 copies of each chromosome, one from the animal's mom and one from dad, sort of like 2 full decks of cards. And both decks can simply be duplicated and then split off to form a new cell. But sex cells are different. They're produced by taking each set of chromosomes, duplicating them, and then swapping a bunch of cards between decks before breaking them up to form 4 cells, each with just 1 complete deck of cards. This card swap works when the decks in each set come from a mom and a dad of the same species, because they have all the same cards in the same order. So genes for eye color get swapped with other genes for eye color, and stripe pattern genes get swapped with stripe pattern genes, giving rise to perfectly healthy sex cells. But in the cells of hybrid animals, the decks aren't identical because they came from parents of different species. So an eye color card might get swapped for a paw size card, or a bone-making gene for a kidney-making gene, producing 2 really weird decks that give rise to totally non-functional sex cells. However, for reasons we really don't understand, it is sometimes possible for a hybrid animal to skip over the card swapping step and sort of just get rid of the dad's chromosomes to create new sex cells that contain only the mom's DNA. We've actually only seen this happen in female mules. There are a handful of documented cases in which mules have made babies from eggs containing only their mother's DNA. Bizarrely, this means that each female mule's offspring was genetically also her half-sibling. So, while as far as we know, pigs never fly, every once in a great while, a mule foals. This video was...
Okay. Back to this. Okay. So that shows you that why hybrids don't usually make fertile offspring, and that every once in a while they can. It's very unusual, but okay. So biodiversity is the complexity of the community. It's a combination of the number of species and the relative abundance of species. So a couple of definitions that go under there. Species richness is just the number of species in a given area. It doesn't matter how many of them. It could be 99% of one plant and then just 1% is 50 other plants. It would have the same species richness as if it was spread out evenly. Species evenness, this talks about whether a particular ecosystem is numerically dominated by one species or all represented by similar numbers of individuals. So species richness is the number of species. It doesn't matter how abundant they are. If there's one organism there, that counts as species richness. Evenness is that there's many species that are kind of evenly distributed. Instead of just having, like in your yard, you might have 99.9% of the organisms are grass, and then there's a few weeds in there. So, and I forgot to put this up as a poll question. Which community has the greatest species richness? What's that? What's that?
Is it a reef?
Oh yeah, I mean in the pictures here.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah, a coral reef and a rainforest have the highest biodiversity, you're right. But in these two pictures, you have 4 species. Here, they're all pretty much spread out. Here, you have most of one species and just a couple of the others. Which one is more rich?
Isn't it equal?
It's equal because there's 4 species, right? But which one is more even, has a greater evenness? So community 1 has an equal amount of each species, where community 2 is 70% of A and then only 10% of the others. So this is a greater species evenness than this one. Okay. So those are 2 terms that we'll be using throughout this. Okay, like Owen just said, biodiversity is unevenly distributed. So this shows the biodiversity of birds in North America. North and Central America. You can see as you go further north, there's only 30 species up here, and then it gets higher. There's a couple of spots with up in the 200s here, and then it gets higher and higher as you go down, and then when you get into the rainforest, you have over 600 species down here, 400 species. So living things are distributed unevenly. Some of it's a latitudinal gradient. In general, species richness increases towards the equator. So again, you have more species as you get down to Central America than you do in the Arctic. And here it is shown a little bit bigger. Again, only about 30 in the far north. And it doesn't even show, this is probably 700 down here, 700 species. And here you can see it kind of works on a global scale too. Yellow showing low numbers of species in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Very few, very few in the Antarctic, less than 100. And then you see the reds and blues showing up in general near the equator. There's a few exceptions where you get further from the equator and you have some hot spots, but and here's another way to look at it. And this isn't even showing the oceans. The coral reefs are mostly in the tropical areas, so you're going to have higher species richness there as well. Okay, so a couple more definitions. These are some you should be very familiar with. Extinction occurs when the last member of a species dies, the species ceases to exist. We've always said extinction is forever. but we're working on that. And there are a lot of people working very hard to bring back extinct species through cloning. Now, we're a long way, and it may never happen with dinosaurs, because the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago, and DNA doesn't last very long. But mammoths and dodo birds and things like that, mammoths, the last ones died out in 2000 BC, so about 4,000 years ago. Dodo birds died out in the 17 or 1800s. There's a lot of things like that we have genetic samples of, and as technology improves, we may be able to clone them. There are people that have pretty good DNA samples from frozen mammoths. There's mammoths that died in the Arctic and were frozen over in the tundra and stayed that way until people found them. They're working to clone this Tasmanian tiger, which we'll talk about later. It's a marsupial carnivore that was wiped out in Tasmania within the last 100 years. So I think maybe not within my lifetime, but probably within yours, we'll be able to start bringing back extinct species. They're actually making gene banks of endangered animals so that when they do, they have more than just one or two species. They can save some of the genetic, or one or two individuals. They can save some of that genetic diversity. So that's interesting to think about, brings up moral issues. Like if you bring back a mammoth, what are you going to do with it? It doesn't have a natural habitat anymore. And so there's questions about that. Do we really want mammoths roaming around Canada? Yeah. Anyway, extinction is not unusual. It's not new. 99% of species that have existed on Earth are extinct. Life has been on Earth for a very long time, and most of those species are gone. Extirpation is a little different. This is the disappearance of a particular population from, let's see, okay, can y'all, I've got the people telling me the screen is frozen. Is it frozen now? That's good, okay. Okay, so I've got a question about whether the tundra would still be suitable for the mammoth. There are places that would be suitable for mammoths, and there are people that think that the ecosystems would be healthier if mammoths were back. North America lost its big animals, we'll talk about this here in a minute, when humans populated North America. Now, whether it's all to blame on humans, people argue about that. Some say there was another reason. But pretty much worldwide, anytime humans get to a continent, the large animals disappear, except Africa. Humans evolved in Africa with those animals, so a lot of them survived because they evolved as the humans evolved. But pretty much everywhere else, humans came suddenly and wiped out most of the large megafauna, is the main belief right now. And so the ecosystem is still there, and there are still niches that large animals like this would fit. And so there are people that want to bring them back and put them in those habitats and see what happens. It's difficult because it's hard to tell what an ice age habitat was like. So anyway, extirpation is different. This is a disappearance of a particular population from a given area, but not the entire species globally. So wolves used to be in pretty much all of North America. Now that most states in North America don't have wolves anymore, they've been extirpated, but wolves still exist. There are some in Yellowstone, there's some in the northern United States and Canada. There's even a few, I think, that have been introduced into parts of New Mexico. There's some birds, some grouse, that if you look at the bird list of New Mexico, they used to be in New Mexico, but they were extirpated. They're now found in Colorado, but not New Mexico. So extirpation is just a regional loss, but the species is still around in other places. And in some places where animals have been extirpated, we have actually gone in and collected animals from places where they're still around and brought them back. And that's what happened in Yellowstone. And we'll talk about that quite a bit later. Extirpation obviously is on the road to extinction. If you wipe them out from one area, they could easily be wiped out from other areas. Okay, something else we'll talk about a lot, endangered species. There are legal definitions, but technically an endangered species is in danger of becoming extinct. There's not very many of them left, and if things keep going like they're going now, they'll be gone. The threatened species is not quite as bad, but it's in danger of becoming endangered. So in the United States, legal system have threatened species and endangered species, and they both have some kind of protections given to them. And endangered species have more protections because they're in more danger. And lots of animals, lots of charismatic animals you think about around the world are endangered. The bald eagle is, if it hasn't become a threatened species now, it may soon. I think they were talking about delisting them. They were almost wiped out by DDT, but DDT's been gone for a long time, so bald eagles are coming back. Sea otters, wolves, and manatees. Manatees have a problem that they live in shallow water and they swim really slow, so boats hit them a lot. And a lot of the tropical animals, pangolins are really cool. Even lions are endangered. Orangutans. Red pandas. Tigers. Okay, so let's talk about extinction for a little bit. There have been 5 global mass extinctions. And actually a 6th that they don't usually talk about, but because it mainly killed off bacteria. So a mass extinction is when large numbers of species went extinct over a relatively short period of time. And it's not real cut and dry, but here is when they pretty much happened. You see there's ups and downs, but there are 5 times when things were really bad. This one's the dinosaurs. That's the one we think about the most. And we'll go over each of these. So here's showing the Earth, and these are the different mass extinctions. The Ordovician, things pretty much froze solid. Late Devonian, lots of volcanic activity. Some of these we don't really know what happened. This was the worst one, the Permian mass extinction. Triassic, Jurassic, basically the formation of the Atlantic Ocean caused a lot of volcanism from the bottom of South America to the top of North America. And then of course the meteor wiped out the dinosaurs, we're pretty sure. There's still arguments. It's kind of hard to decide what caused things that happened millions and millions of years ago. They argue about the meteor. We know the meteor impact happened, but whether that was just the last straw for the dinosaurs or if that was what wiped them all out, it's hard to tell. Hopefully this video will work.
In the 1970s, a scientist named Jack Sepkoski embarked on the most ambitious fossil hunt.
So you may have already seen this one. If not, you can watch it today. I'll just go ahead and pass this one over. Okay, so the first that we talk about is called the Great Oxygenation Event, 2.2 billion years ago. Before this point, there were lots of different kinds of bacteria on the planet, and they were probably mostly chemosynthetic, breaking down chemicals. And oxygen is a very reactive chemical and is pretty harsh on life unless it's adapted to it. So 2.2 billion years ago around, the first photosynthetic bacteria showed up, blue-green algae, and they started producing oxygen. And you can see the oxygen levels went up over time. And for a while, it almost killed everything. because nothing was adapted. Not even the photosynthetic bacteria were adapted to having higher levels of oxygen. So that was an extinction event, but it's only bacteria, so you don't hear about it very much. But this was the time, about 2.2 billion years ago, that the first free oxygen started showing up in our atmosphere. Oxygen is very reactive, and usually it doesn't stick around in the atmosphere. The only reason we have oxygen to breathe is because plants and algae are continuously producing oxygen and putting it into the environment. If that stopped, oxygen would pretty much go away. It reacts with metal. That's what rust is. Rust is taking oxygen out of the air, reacts with all kinds of rocks. Animals breathe it. All kinds of stuff is going on to take oxygen out of the air. So without life, you would never have free oxygen in the levels that we have it now. And when these bacteria started photosynthesizing, it was a shock to the ecosystem, a huge change. Okay, the end of the Ordovician era was 443 million years ago. Ice sheets advanced and then retreated, and when they advanced, they changed the ocean currents, and it was some people call it a snowball Earth. The Earth is pretty much frozen over. All the oceans are frozen over. That changed the currents drastically, and so that killed a bunch of stuff. And then they melted, and that changed things again for the things that had survived. 86% of the species and 57% of the genera, which is just plural for genus, went extinct. Many trilobites, if you're familiar with trilobites, they're very common fossils of these interesting arthropods. And most brachiopods went extinct. There's still a few brachiopods alive today. But 86% of the species, y'all remember what genuses are, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So 57% of the genus, the genera, went extinct, and 86% of the species. End of the Devonian. This was 359 to 380 million years ago. Don't really know what caused this one. Possibilities include everything from volcanic activity or a meteor strike or even a nearby supernova. There's not any stars near enough to us now that a supernova could cause us problems, but at different times, through 359 to 380 million years ago, there could have been stars that were much closer. And if one went supernova, it could do things like destroy the ozone layer, things like that. Oxygen levels in the oceans dropped dramatically, which killed a lot of the things living in the ocean. 75% of the species and 35% of the genera went extinct. Not quite as bad. Lost most of the placoderms, which were really cool looking armored fish. More trilobites, and of course lots of other things. But placoderms are pretty cool. Some of the earliest jawed fish with really heavy armor around them. This one had a bite force that was stronger than, as far as we can tell, its bite force would have been stronger than anything alive today. End of the Permian, the big dying. This was the worst one. 251 million years ago, probably caused by massive volcanic activity in Siberia. This lasted about 50,000 years ago, so it's not like a meteor hit and everything died. This took 50,000 years, which geologically isn't very long, but it's still, it wasn't a sudden thing as we look at things. 96% of species, 56% of genera, 50% of the families went extinct. Half of all the families on Earth. Nearly all the trees were killed. Many amphibians and the last of the trilobites. So the trilobites went extinct totally at the end of the Permian. They call this the big dying. So this was a really major extinction. Not that any of them would have been fun to live through. But. The end of the Triassic. You don't hear about this one very often. was 201 million years ago. And this probably was caused when Pangea broke up. North and South America split away from Africa and Eurasia. And you saw all the volcanoes along where the Atlantic Ocean is now. There's the mid-Atlantic ridge that still has a lot of volcanic activity, but it's underwater now. But that was a string of volcanoes from the North Pole to the South Pole, and that's probably what caused this. 80% of the species and 47% of the genera went extinct. Many fish and reptiles went extinct. There were some dinosaurs already at this point, and some of them would have gone extinct. And then the one that we always hear about, 65 million years ago, probably caused by a meteor impact in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Chicxulub meteor. 76% of the species, 40% of the genera went extinct. We lost all the non-avian dinosaurs, they usually say, because some people consider birds to still be dinosaurs. And the ammonites, which are a nautilus-type creature that we can find fossils of a lot today, they all went extinct. Made room for the mammals. There were mammals around when the dinosaurs were here, but they were not a lot. There weren't a lot of them. They weren't very diverse. But when the dinosaurs were gone, the mammals and birds filled in those niches. Okay, so these are the ones that the big five mass extinctions. There's another one that we're going to talk about though, and people have started to talk about, oh, well, let me show this video first. This is from Walking with Dinosaurs, and it's kind of it's showing what it might have been like when that meteor hit if you were in North America.
The weeks pass, and above the brilliant volcanic sunsets, there are the telltale warning signs of an even more destructive natural disaster. Showers of shooting stars herald the approach of a giant comet on a collision course with the Earth. Crashes into Earth. The light from the impact fades in silence. Then the shock waves arrive. Next comes the blast front. Finally, a rain of molten rock starts to fall out of the darkening sky. This is the end of the age of the dinosaurs. The comet struck the Gulf of Mexico with the force of 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. In the catastrophic climate changes that followed, 65% of life died out. It took millions of years for Earth to recover, and when it did, the giant dinosaurs were gone, never to return.
Okay, so just to give you an idea what that was like, within minutes, 3/4 of North America was on fire. It hit at an angle, so it hit facing north, so the shockwave mostly went north from Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula, and 3/4 of North America was on fire within minutes. And just the smoke from those fires alone would have caused climate change. But you also have all the other stuff that was shot up by the meteor impact, so it would have been a huge global changes in climate, temperature. It probably was wasn't a lot of sunlight for years, all kinds of issues that definitely impacted the dinosaurs. Now, people will argue about whether that was the only impact or if it was just the last straw to when they were already dying out. We don't really know. But some people think they know, but they argue about it. All right, one more thing and I'll let y'all go. The next mass extinction that people have started to talk about is the Holocene, which is right now, or the Anthropocene extinction. If you know your etymology, anthropo means human. So anthropology is the study of humanity. So the Anthropocene is the one caused by humanity. So some scientists feel that we are currently causing a sixth mass extinction. The extinction rates are way higher than the background levels because of our activities. Some blame the extinction of the megafauna of North America 13,000 years ago on humanity, when humans first colonized North America. Some blame the extinction of the Australian megafauna around 70,000 years ago on humans. People argue about whether humans did this, but it's odd that we've got several mass extinctions when humans first arrived somewhere. And it's very coincidental if it wasn't humans doing it, but we don't really know. But a lot of people think that when humanity arrives, most of the big species disappeared. So in the past 125,000 years, the average size of wildlife has decreased 14%. Since 1500, about 875 species have gone extinct, and this is well above the background rate. There's several that we don't know about, and at least one that we know about that have gone extinct in your lifetimes. The Baiji, which is the Yangtze River dolphin, we're pretty sure went extinct in the last 10 years. But North America used to look like Africa. These things were all around in North America. We had rhinos, this thing, Paraceratherium, which you will be familiar with if you've ever played Ark, Megatherium. We had saber-toothed cats, and I'm not familiar with this one, but we had lots and lots of really large things in North America. I think our largest native animals now are like the moose and the bison, but we don't have lots of these things like we used to. And if you watched Ice Age, we had giant armadillos. Armadillos almost the size of a Volkswagen. Here's others. We had camels, mastodons, mammoths, dire wolves, ground sloths. This is kind of interesting. They found footprints recently in White Sands, which is in New Mexico, of a hunt of ground sloths. They've got tracks of ground sloths and tracks of humans fighting them and killing or hunting them. We had an American lion, saber-toothed cats, really large bears, horses. Horses were wiped out at the end of one of the last ice ages and weren't here until the Spaniards brought them. Australia had megafauna too. Giant kangaroos, some other things you can't even give names to. Really odd creatures. The last mammoth died out about 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC on an island about the time Stonehenge was completed. And we'll talk about these some more tomorrow. I'm keeping you longer than I usually do. So we'll go ahead and stop there, and we'll talk about biodiversity some more on Thursday. Y'all have a good day.